Imagine this: Halifax, Nova Scotia, December 6th, 1917. Just after 8 in the morning. It's a cold, clear Thursday. The kind of morning where your breath fogs in front of you, and the harbor looks almost beautiful. Ships moving slowly through the steel gray water. Steam rising off the docks. The city humming to life around you. Vince Coleman is at his desk inside the Richmond Railway Station, doing what he does every morning. Monitoring telegraph lines, tracking train schedules, making sure everything moves the way it's supposed to. Train number 10 is inbound. Hundreds of passengers, families, workers, soldiers on leave. It's running on time, heading straight into the heart of the city, scheduled to arrive at the Richmond depot within the hour. Across the harbor, two ships have just collided. One of them, a French cargo vessel called the Mont Blanc, is on fire. From the shore, it looks like a dramatic but manageable incident. A burning ship with thick black smoke. People are stopping on their way to work to watch. Some are climbing onto rooftops for a better view. Children are pressing their faces to school windows. Unfortunately, no one on the shore knows what the Mont Blanc is carrying. But Vince Coleman does. He's just been told the Mont Blanc is loaded with 2,900 tons of explosives, TNT, picric acid, gun cotton, the most volatile cargo a ship can carry, and it's drifting, burning, directly toward Pier 6. His co-worker grabs his arm. "We have to run! Now!" Coleman stands up. He takes one step toward the door, and then he stops, because train number 10 is still coming. Believe it or not, what Vince Coleman did in the next 60 seconds would save hundreds of lives, and cost him his own. Welcome to Believe It or Not, the show where weird is real and the truth is stranger than fiction. I'm your host, Bryan, and today's story is about the largest man-made explosion in history, before the atomic bomb. A city that was changed forever in a single moment, and one train dispatcher who had the chance to run and chose not to. This is the story of Vince Coleman, and the 60 seconds that made him one of the most quietly heroic figures in Canadian history. The Mont Blanc had arrived in Halifax Harbor the previous evening, delayed by fog. She was a French cargo ship requisitioned for the war effort. World War I was in its third year, and the Allies desperately needed munitions and explosives shipped to the front lines in Europe. The Mont Blanc was carrying one of the most dangerous loads ever assembled on a single ship. 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of high-octane aviation fuel, and 10 tons of gun cotton, an explosive more sensitive than dynamite. The ship carried no warning flags. Under wartime secrecy protocols, her deadly cargo was classified. To anyone watching from shore, she looked like any other supply ship. On the morning of December 6th, navigating the narrow entrance to Halifax Harbor, the Mont Blanc collided with a Norwegian relief ship called the Emo, moving in the opposite direction. Now, the collision itself caused only minor damage. A scrape, just a little bit of grinding metal. But the Emo's bow had torn open barrels of aviation fuel stored on the Mont Blanc's deck, and sparks from the collision ignited them immediately. Within minutes, the Mont Blanc was burning, and her crew knew exactly what that meant. The crew launched lifeboats and rowed for shore as fast as they could, abandoning the ship without, and this is critical, without raising any warning signal to the people on shore as to why they were fleeing with such desperate urgency. The burning Mont Blanc drifted slowly toward Pier 6, and Halifax watched, curious and completely unaware. Back in his office, Vince Coleman learned the truth from a colleague who had spoken directly to a Mont Blanc crew member stumbling ashore. The ship, the cargo, what was coming? He and his colleague ran from the station. They made it about a half a block, and then Coleman stopped. Train number 10 was somewhere on the line, approaching Halifax. Hundreds of passengers. If it pulled into the Richmond depot, which was less than a quarter mile from Pier 6, those people would be directly in the blast zone when the Mont Blanc went up. There was no time to reach the train by any other means. There was only the telegraph. Coleman turned around, ran back into the station, and sat down at his key and started transmitting. The message he sent, transcribed from the telegraph records that survived, read, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6, and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." The message traveled down the line. Train number 10 stopped outside the city. 35 seconds later, some accounts say less, the Mont Blanc exploded. There are no adequate words for what happened at 9:04 a.m. on December 6th, 1917. The Mont Blanc's cargo detonated in what remains to this day the largest accidental man-made explosion in human history. The ship itself was vaporized instantly. Its anchor, weighing over a half a ton, was blasted 4 kilometers inland, where it landed in a field and sat for decades as a monument to what had happened. A piece of the ship's cannon was found 5.6 kilometers away. The explosion released energy equivalent to roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT. A pressure wave traveled outward at supersonic speed, demolishing the Richmond neighborhood of Halifax almost entirely. 1,600 buildings destroyed. 12,000 damaged. The harbor water was blasted away from the shore, exposing the seabed momentarily before rushing back in as a tsunami that swept through the devastated waterfront. Windows shattered 80 kilometers away in Truro. The sound was heard in Prince Edward Island, over 200 kilometers distant. Nearly 2,000 people were killed. Another 9,000 were injured. Approximately 6,000 were left homeless. In December, in Canada. And those people who had gathered at windows to watch the burning ship, and there were many of them, were cut to pieces by shattering glass when the shock wave hit. Vince Coleman was killed at his desk. He never left the station. Here's what I find almost impossible to fully absorb about Vince Coleman. He knew. When he sat back down at the telegraph key, he knew what he was up to. He knew what was on that ship. He knew what was coming. He knew he probably wasn't going to make it out. And he sent the message anyway. And then he stayed at his post. Not because anyone ordered him to. Not because there was any realistic chance of survival. But because there might have been one more message to send. One more train to warn. One more thing he could do. You see, we often talk about heroism as though it's a personality trait, something certain people have that others don't. But Vince Coleman, he was just a train dispatcher, an ordinary man with an ordinary job, doing paperwork on an ordinary Thursday morning. He didn't have special training for this. He didn't have a plan. He had 60 seconds and a telegraph key, and the knowledge that a train was coming. and he made a choice. The most extraordinary thing about Vince Coleman isn't that he was exceptional. It's that he wasn't. Not until the moment he needed to be. Now, here are a few believe it or not facts I found while researching the podcast. Believe it or not, the Mont Blanc's anchor, weighing over 500 kilograms, was blasted 4 kilometers inland by the force of the explosion. It sat in a field outside Halifax for years before being recovered and placed on permanent display as a monument. A single piece of a ship, launched by the explosion nearly 3 miles through the air, became a memorial to what a single moment of physics can do. Believe it or not, every year Nova Scotia sends a large Christmas tree to the city of Boston, and has done so every single year since 1971. It's a formal thank you for the relief supplies, doctors, and aid workers Boston sent to Halifax within hours of the explosion in 1917. Over 100 years later, the gratitude is still being expressed. Every Christmas tree on Boston Common traces back to December 6th, 1917. Believe it or not, the people who died watching from windows were killed not by the blast itself, but by the pressure waves shattering the glass they were standing behind. Doctors treating the injured that day encountered a pattern of eye injuries so severe and so widespread that the Halifax explosion significantly advanced the field of ophthalmology. The treatment of eye injuries. Simply by producing more cases than doctors had ever seen in one place at one time. Believe it or not, the pilot who was guiding the Mont Blanc into the harbor that morning, a man named Francis Mackey, survived the explosion and lived until 1961, dying at the age of 83. For decades after the disaster, he was widely blamed for the collision and lived under enormous public suspicion and hostility. A formal inquiry eventually concluded the collision resulted from errors on both ships. Mackey spent 44 years living with blame for something that was not entirely his fault. Believe it or not, Vince Coleman's telegraph message, "Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys," is one of the most famous final transmissions in Canadian history. The message stopped train number 10 approximately 2 kilometers outside the city. And estimates on how many lives were saved ranged from 200 to over 700. The exact number can never be known, which somehow makes it more affecting, not less. And finally, believe it or not, the Halifax explosion was so unprecedented that the word for what had happened didn't exist yet. Newspapers initially reported it as a possible German attack, because in 1917, no one could conceive of an accidental explosion of that magnitude. The concept of an industrial accident producing a nuclear scale detonation, it simply wasn't part of anyone's mental model of the world. And it took several days for the full picture to emerge. And when it did, it changed how the world thought about the dangers of explosive cargo forever. Believe it or not. Now, it's quiz time. Let's see how much you were paying attention. I'll ask the question. You shout out the answer. Are you ready? Then let's get started. Question number 1. What was the Mont Blanc carrying? And why didn't anyone on shore know? The answer? It was carrying over 2,900 tons of explosives, including TNT and picric acid. But under wartime secrecy protocols, the cargo was classified and the ship carried no warning flags. Question 2. What did Vince Coleman's telegraph message say? And what did it accomplish? The answer? It warned incoming train number 10 to stop, telling them an ammunition ship was on fire and about to explode. It stopped the train outside the city and saved hundreds of lives. And Coleman signed off with his famous final tagline. "Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." And finally, question number 3. True or false? The Halifax Explosion was initially reported as a German attack. That's 100% true. The explosion was so unprecedented that newspapers initially assumed it must be enemy warfare, because in 1917, no one could imagine an accidental explosion of that scale. Vince Coleman had 60 seconds, a telegraph key, and a choice. He could have kept running. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody would have even known. So here's a question for you to think about. What does it mean to do the right thing when nobody is watching? And when nobody would ever know if you didn't? And do you think most people, faced with that same 60 seconds, would make the same choice Vince Coleman did? How about you? If you're enjoying Believe It or Not, follow or subscribe wherever you listen. And share this episode with someone who's never heard the name Vince Coleman, because more people should know it. And next time on Believe It or Not, imagine you're walking through foggy Victorian London. Dark cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps flickering in the mist. And then, cutting through it all, a sound so sharp and so clear that everyone within 100 meters stops what they're doing. One small device fits in the palm of your hand, but would go on to change policing, referee every major sport on Earth, guide ships through fog, and save lives in disasters across the world. And it was invented by a man who was trying to build something else entirely, and then dropped it on the floor. The surprisingly fascinating story of Joseph Hudson and the pea whistle. You won't want to miss it. But before we go, here's a little boat joke for you. What causes some boats to become party boats? Peer pressure. Until next time, keep wondering, keep learning, and remember, sometimes the truth is weirder than fiction.